Okay, time for some more Tumtum and Nutmeg. Adventures Beyond Nutmouse Hall, Chapter 2. A few days after the school pipes burst, it started to snow. It was only fleeting at first, and when the Nutmouses poked their noses outdoors after breakfast, it looked as if it might not stick. But it snowed all day, thicker and faster, and by the afternoon, the whole village had been blanketed. Shortly after 4 o'clock, Nutmeg visited the Mildew's kitchen to borrow a few bits and pieces for her bread and butter pudding, and there was snow blustering in under the garden door. It was so cold she could see her breath making little gray clouds in the air. She didn't linger long, for the Mildews seldom had much worth borrowing, and this afternoon there was even less than usual. There were neither currants nor cinnamon in the cupboard, and nothing on the floor but a bit of squished banana. There was a scrap of fruitcake left on the table, but it was so stale that when Nutmeg bumped into it, she stubbed her toe. And when she climbed onto the toast rack to poke her nose down inside the milk bottle, she could see a film of white ice. Brrr! Drawing her woolen cape tight around her shoulders, she chiseled a corner off of a pat of frosty butter and then scuttled as fast as she could back to Nutmouse Hall. Tumtum was in the kitchen, leaning against the stove. He was hoping for some tea. "Oh, Tumtum, I don't know what's to become of those Mildews," Nutmeg said forlornly, plonking her wicker basket on the table. If you are saying something forlornly, it's kind of sadly. If you're forlorn, you're so sad. "Their kitchen's so cold that the milk started to freeze, and all the cupboards are bare. They need a fairy godmother to take charge of them." Nutmeg longed to go through Rose Cottage with her mop and pail, scrubbing and darning and mending and mothering and fussing about from top to bottom, but she was only a mouse, so what use could she possibly be? She couldn't even lift one of the mildew saucers. Tumtum looked thoughtful. He knew that Nutmeg was upset about the conditions next door, and he had something to propose. "How about a little snack, Nutmeg dear?" he said, for he never liked proposing things on an empty stomach. Nutmeg scurried about in the kitchen and laid the table with a dainty blue and white teapot and homemade gingerbread and macaroons and cucumber sandwiches and scones with butter and jam, but she was feeling too upset to eat more than a couple of mouthfuls. "Oh, if only we could help them, Tumtum," she groaned helplessly, watching him eat. "Perhaps we can," he replied mysteriously, and then he retrieved a crumpled piece of paper from his waistcoat pocket and studied it through his crescent-shaped glasses. "I had a look around the attic this morning while the children were asleep, and I made a list of 1 or 2 things we could do," he said. "For a start, I could repair the electric heater." "Repair the heater?" Nutmeg asked incredulously. If you're incredulous, you're like shocked and amazed, like, "What? Repair the heater? How do you intend to do that?" Here is Tumtum with his big list. It's a big list. And his glasses, there's Nutmeg. "Very simply," Tumtum replied, helping himself to a fat slice of gingerbread. "I just need to crawl inside and do a spot of rewiring. It's the sort of thing a mouse can do much more easily than a human." Tumtum was keen on rewiring. He had once rewired the whole of Nutmouse Hall. Nutmeg beamed. "That's a good idea, Tumtum," she said. "Then the children won't have to sleep in their winter coats anymore." "Quite so," Tumtum said, feeling rather pleased with himself. "And there's plenty more we can see to. Arthur's glasses are about to fall apart because there are 2 screws loose in the frame. So I'll take my drill up to the attic and I'll tighten them again." "Tumtum, how wonderful!" Nutmeg cried. "What can I do?" "All sorts of things," he said reassuringly. "You can darn some of their clothes for a start. If you darn something, it means you're mending it, you're fixing it. Like if you darn a pair of socks or a sock, you're fixing a hole in the sock to make it look like a regular sock again. So you can darn some of their clothes for a start. You're a fast sewer, and if you do a small amount each evening, everything will be mended within a week or so. And you can patch their shoes, too, using the leather from that old armchair in my dressing room. I never much liked it. Anyway, it's rather in the way there. And why not use some of your clothesline to replace the lace in Arthur's boot? You hardly need it anymore now that we have a tumble dryer." And so Tumtum went on, suggesting more and more ingenious ways to help. If it's ingenious, it's like brilliant, like it's a genius idea. Ingenious, brilliant. He had brilliant, ingenious ways to help. "When can we start?" Nutmeg asked eagerly, feeling much too excited to drink her tea. "There's no time like the present," Tumtum said. "I vote we set out tonight." Nutmeg agreed to this, and that was how the adventures began. Remember, it's called Adventures Beyond Nutmouse Hall. And you might think that that's the end of the chapter, but do you see that little symbol there? Kind of flowery symbol. That means it's a pause in the chapter. I think we're going to change settings or time. So sometimes you'll be reading, especially in a chapter book, and there will be a little break, and that means, oh, we're still in the same chapter, but we're moving to like a different time or place. Okay. Shortly after 10 o'clock, Nutmeg pressed her little brown nose through the front gate and twitched it back and forth under the dresser. Twitch, twitch, twitch. All clear, Tumtum, she called back to her husband, who was following behind her carrying a wooden toolbox and a drill and dragging the bulky leather chair cover. Nutmeg was carrying her sewing basket and her mop and pail and also the clothesline, which was wound around her shoulder like a lasso. Okay, I have a question for you. Is this book fantasy or realistic fiction? We've been talking about that, right? Could this really happen? Would the mice be dressed in clothes and talking? And probably not, no. So it's fantasy, right? And realistic fiction would be something that would actually, a made up story that could actually happen. All right. It doesn't stop me from really visualizing it. Remember the visualize strategy. It doesn't stop me from visualizing it in my mind and feeling like it's real. Okay, they crossed the kitchen floor and crept into the hall, and then they dragged all their clobber up the baseboard, which ran along the stairs, and tiptoed across the landing. There was light glinting beneath the study door, and when they peeked underneath it, they could see Mr. Mildew crouched on the floor amid a sea of brightly colored wires and tiny shards of metal. His face was purple, and he was cursing under his breath. Awful creature! I wonder what he's inventing now, Nutmeg whispered. A battery-operated mouse that gobbles all the crumbs off a dinner table like a vacuum. Tumtum said knowingly. I heard him tell Arthur about it. He thinks it's going to make him rich again. It's called the Hungry House Mouse. Goodness, Nutmeg said. What a curious idea. I wonder why it's making him so angry. I believe he's got the mechanics wrong, Tumtum said. Instead of a hungry mouse, he's invented an unusually delicate one. No sooner has it gobbled the crumbs than it throws them all out again. Oh, what a waste, Nutmeg said, shaking her head disapprovingly. A real mouse would do the job much better. The mice pressed on and heaved their things up the steep stairs to the attic. The room was bitterly cold, for there were no curtains to keep out the draft, and they had to blow on their paws to stop them from going numb. They had trouble getting their bearings, for it was quite dark at first, but then the clouds scudded in the wind, and the moon, not the mouse, the moon shone through the window onto the children's beds. Arthur was completely buried under his blankets, but they could see Lucy's hair on her pillow shining red in the moonlight. Here is the next picture. That's the one I showed in chapter 1, right, as a preview. Look at what Tumtum's doing with the glasses. And Nutmeg looks like she's cleaning maybe the mirror on the wardrobe. The mice worked furiously. Tumtum got the heater going and drilled Arthur's glasses back into shape, and Nutmeg darned 3 pairs of socks and swept out both of the children's satchels. Satchel is another word for like a backpack. Then she climbed into the sink with her mop and polished it until it became so slippery she couldn't stand up again. Tumtum had to throw the plug down to her so she could clamber free up the chain. Finally, she scuttled off to the wardrobe to start mending Arthur's and Lucy's clothes. They were so full of holes that Nutmeg reckoned it would take her weeks to get through them all, and some were so threadbare it was hardly worth mending them at all. As she persevered with her tiny needle, she could hear the children's soft, steady breathing from the other side of the room. They were deeply asleep, quite innocent of all of the bustle that was going on. Nutmeg felt fiercely protective of them. Mr. Mildew is simply not capable of looking after 2 children on his own, she thought sternly, setting to work on a gaping hole in the elbow of one of Arthur's sweaters. They need a mother, and in the absence of a human one, I will have to do. And as she set herself the responsibility of mothering the Mildews, Nutmeg felt a warm glow in her stomach. She and Tumtum had never had a litter of their own, and she considered herself very blessed to be able to adopt 2 human children instead. The mice toiled away until midnight when they decided to stop for a rest. Nutmeg had tucked 2 slices of fruitcake and a thermos of tea into her sewing basket, and they both felt much in need of them. Bother, she said, unpacking the picnic. I forgot to pack any plastic cups. Oh, never mind, said Tumtum, who could feel his tummy rumbling. We can swig from the thermos. But Nutmeg was much more particular about such things. Look, Tumtum, she cried, pointing towards a tall pink building in the corner. Lucy's dollhouse. It's sure to have a tea set. The mice walked towards it and peered through the living room window. It was not nearly so big as their living room at Nutmouse Hall, but it was prettily furnished with pale blue curtains and a grand piano. There were 2 dolls made of pipe cleaners sitting on the sofa, and there was a case full of books by the fire. Something about the house seemed to beckon them inside. They passed underneath the white awning and pushed the front door. It swung open, leading into an airy hall with a coat rack and a grandfather clock. To the right was the kitchen, in which there stood a long dining table with benches down each side. There were lots of pots and pans hanging above the stove, and Nutmeg found a whole hodgepodge of mismatched china in the cupboards. Everything was mouse-sized. Nutmeg set the table, and they both sat down feeling very civilized. If you feel very civilized, you are just doing things so properly. So civilized. We've still got an awful lot to do, Nutmeg said wearily, and if we don't finish tonight, we'll have to lug all our stuff back down upstairs again tomorrow night. Oh, we needn't do that, Nutmeg, Tumtum replied. We could leave everything here in the dollhouse. We can tuck it all away somewhere so Lucy won't find it. Oh, Tumtum, what a good idea, she cried. And then we can just come back and do more chores whenever we have time. So they worked for another hour or so, and then they crept back to the dollhouse and put the toolbox and the sewing basket in the cupboard under the stairs. The mop and pail wouldn't fit, so Nutmeg hid them behind the kitchen door. And then by instinct, she cleared away their cups and plates from the table and put them in the dollhouse sink. There was no running water, but she could fill it next time with her bucket. I do so like this dollhouse, Tumtum. It feels a bit like camping, Nutmeg said, and she thought the next time she came, she would bring a new tablecloth for the kitchen. Tumtum was longing to get home, for he was quite exhausted, but Nutmeg found it a wrench to leave. She would have given anything to have seen the children's faces when they woke up to find their heater working, for by now the attic was lovely and warm. We could spend the night here, she suggested, but Tumtum was having none of it. That would be very rash, Nutmeg, he said. They might see us. They both agreed that it would not do at all, for some humans have funny feelings towards mice. So Tumtum took his wife by the paw, and they scuttled back to Nutmouse Hall and collapsed into their 4-poster bed. A 4-poster bed is one of those beds where each corner has a big post coming up, so it's called a 4-poster bed. Okay. All right, chapter 3 is next. I will give you a preview of the next chapter. It looks like, whoops, sorry. It looks like the children are discovering things in the next chapter.